In the scorching heat of the Arizona desert, where rattlesnakes coil in the shade and vultures circle overhead, there lived a man who had built walls around his heart so high that no woman had ever climbed them. Jake Morrison was his name, and loneliness was his companion. For 38 years, he had walked this earth believing that love was nothing more than a fool's game, a weakness that got good men killed. But on a dusty morning in September, when the cottonwood leaves were just beginning to whisper of autumn's approach, an Apache widow named Maria Yazzie would speak 7 simple words that would shatter every defense he had ever built. Words so powerful, so true, that they would reach into the deepest corners of his guarded soul and change the course of 2 broken lives forever. This is not a story about romance. This is a story about survival, about the courage it takes to trust again when life has given you every reason not to. This is about what happens when 2 people who have lost everything discover that sometimes the greatest strength comes not from standing alone, but from having the courage to stand together. What were those 7 words? And why did they have the power to reach a man that no one else could touch? The answer lies in the red dust and ancient wisdom of the Apache reservation, where the old ways still run deep, and where a woman who had buried her husband and children would teach a hardened cowboy that the heart, no matter how scarred, never truly stops hoping for home. Jake Morrison had been alone for so long that he had forgotten what it felt like to miss someone. The silence of his small ranch house had become his closest friend, broken only by the sound of his boots on the wooden floor and the occasional bark of his old dog, Rex. At 38, Jake had mastered the art of keeping people at arm's length, a skill he had learned through years of disappointment and betrayal. The morning sun was already beating down mercilessly as Jake checked the fence line on the northern border of his property. His ranch sat on the edge of the Apache reservation in Arizona, a piece of land that most folks considered cursed. The previous 3 owners had all lost everything within 5 years of buying it. Drought, disease, accidents, and heartbreak had claimed each one. But Jake wasn't most folks, and he wasn't afraid of curses. He was afraid of something much worse, letting another human being close enough to hurt him. His hands worked automatically as he repaired a section where the barbed wire had snapped during last month's storm. These were hands that told a story, scarred from years of ranch work, marked by a life lived outdoors under the unforgiving desert sun. They were steady hands, reliable hands, hands that had never worn a wedding ring and never would. The sound of hoofbeats made Jake look up from his work. A horse and rider were approaching from the direction of the reservation, moving at an easy pace that suggested no urgency. Jake squinted against the bright morning light, trying to make out who it might be. Visitors were rare out here, and unexpected ones even more so. As the rider drew closer, Jake could see it was a woman on a paint horse, her dark hair braided down her back, her skin bronzed by years in the sun. She rode with the easy confidence of someone who had been born in the saddle, her posture relaxed but alert. Something about the way she moved told Jake she was Apache, probably from the reservation that bordered his land. The woman brought her horse to a stop about 20 feet away, far enough to be respectful, but close enough to speak without shouting. She studied Jake for a long moment with dark eyes that seemed to see more than most people's. There was something ancient in those eyes, something that spoke of wisdom earned through suffering. "You're the one they call Morrison," she said finally. Her voice was soft but carried clearly in the still morning air. It wasn't a question. Jake straightened up, his muscles tense despite himself. He had learned long ago to be wary of strangers, especially ones who seemed to know things about him. "Depends who's asking," he replied, his voice carefully neutral. The woman smiled slightly, but it was a sad sort of smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I'm Maria Yazzie. I live on the reservation." She paused, seemingly choosing her words carefully. "I came to talk to you about water rights." Jake's jaw tightened. Water rights were a constant source of tension between the ranchers and the reservation. The ancient springs that fed both his land and The Apache territory had been the subject of disputes for generations. Most of those disputes had been settled in courtrooms, with lawyers and judges who understood property law, but nothing about the desert or the people who lived in it. Water rights are handled through the county office, Jake said, turning back to his fence work. You'll need to file your papers there. But Maria didn't leave. Instead, she dismounted and ground-tied her horse, then walked closer to where Jake was working. He could smell the sage in her clothes, could hear the soft jingle of silver jewelry as she moved. When he looked up again, she was standing just a few feet away, close enough that he could see the fine lines around her eyes that spoke of years spent squinting against the sun. The papers don't tell the whole story, she said quietly. They never do. There was something in her voice that made Jake pause in his work. He had heard that tone before, usually from people who had lost something important and were trying to figure out how to get it back. It was a sound he recognized because he heard it in his own voice sometimes, late at night when he thought no one was listening. What story is that? He found himself asking, despite his better judgment. Maria looked out across the vast expanse of desert that stretched between them and the distant mountains. The land was harsh and unforgiving, but there was a stark beauty in its emptiness that few people understood. It was a place where only the strongest survived, where weakness was quickly exposed and eliminated. My grandmother used to tell stories about this land, Maria said, her voice taking on the cadence of someone reciting something sacred. She said that long ago, when the world was young, the spirits put special springs here, not just for water, but for healing. The water from these springs could heal the body, but more than that, it could heal the spirit. Jake found himself listening despite his usual instinct to cut conversations short. There was something hypnotic about the way Maria spoke, something that reminded him of summer evenings long ago when his own grandmother would tell stories on the front porch while the crickets sang in the gathering darkness. My grandmother said the springs were gifts, Maria continued, not to be owned by any one person, but to be shared. The spirits who made them knew that healing was something everyone needed, Apache and white man alike. The cynical part of Jake wanted to snort in derision. He had heard plenty of stories about spirits and healing over the years, usually from people who wanted something from him. But something in Maria's manner stopped him from dismissing her words outright. She wasn't asking for anything, wasn't trying to convince him of anything. She was simply telling him what her grandmother had told her. That's a nice story, Jake said finally, his tone carefully noncommittal. But stories don't hold up in court. Maria turned to look at him directly, and for a moment Jake felt as though she could see straight through him to all the carefully hidden hurt and anger he carried inside. It was an uncomfortable feeling, like being stripped bare under the desert sun. No, she agreed quietly. They don't. But sometimes stories tell us more about the truth than all the papers and courts in the world. Jake had been about to dismiss her and get back to his work when something in her expression stopped him. There was a depth of sadness in her dark eyes that he recognized, a particular kind of pain that came from losing the people you loved most. It was a look he had seen in his own mirror more times than he cared to count. You've lost people, he said suddenly, the words coming out before he could stop them. Maria nodded slowly. My husband and my 2 children. Car accident 3 years ago. Her voice was steady, but Jake could hear the weight of grief beneath the calm surface. Drunk driver ran them off the road coming back from town. The simple, matter-of-fact way she said it hit Jake harder than if she had broken down crying. He knew that tone, knew the way grief eventually settled into a person's bones until it became just another fact of existence, like the color of your eyes or the sound of your own heartbeat. I'm sorry, he said, and meant it. The words fell inadequate, but they were all he had. The water from the springs, Maria said, changing the subject so smoothly that Jake almost didn't notice. It was the last thing my grandmother showed me before she died. She took me there when I was 7 years old, made me promise to remember. She was quiet for a long moment, looking out across the desert toward the hills where the springs lay hidden among the rocks, and scrub brush. Jake found himself following her gaze, trying to see the land through her eyes. "What did she want you to remember?" he asked. "That some things are bigger than we are," Maria replied. "That some things are meant to be shared, not hoarded. That the land doesn't belong to us, we belong to it." Jake had heard similar sentiments from environmentalists and activists over the years, but coming from Maria, the words carried a different weight. This wasn't political rhetoric or philosophical abstraction. This was something deeper, something rooted in generations of living on this harsh, beautiful land. "The springs feed your wells too," Maria continued. "The same water that flows under my grandmother's burial ground flows under your pastures. In the old days, people understood that meant we were connected, whether we liked it or not." Jake looked down at his hands, still gripping the fence pliers. The metal was hot from the sun, almost burning his palms, but he didn't let go. Physical pain was easier to deal with than the complicated emotions that Maria's words were stirring up inside him. "Connection is dangerous," he said finally. "People who depend on each other just end up disappointing each other." It was the closest thing to honesty he had shared with a stranger in years, and he immediately regretted it. But Maria didn't pounce on his admission or try to argue with him. Instead, she nodded as if she understood exactly what he meant. "Yes," she said simply, "it is dangerous." The acknowledgement surprised Jake. He had expected her to try to convince him otherwise, to tell him that connection was worth the risk or that isolation was worse than vulnerability. Instead, she had simply agreed with him, as if the danger was obvious and didn't need to be debated. But Maria continued after a moment, "So is walking through the desert alone. The spirits that made the springs, they knew that too." Jake looked up at her, studying her face in the bright morning light. There were no easy answers there, no simple solutions or comforting platitudes. Just the steady gaze of someone who had walked through her own desert of grief and somehow found her way to the other side. "What do you want from me?" he asked bluntly. It was a question he had learned to ask early and often a way of cutting through pretense and getting to the heart of what people really wanted. "Nothing," Maria said, and Jake believed her. "I came to tell you about the water because my grandmother asked me to. She said someday a man would come to live on this land who needed to understand about the springs. She said he would be a man who had forgotten how to trust, how to hope. She said the water could help him remember, but only if he understood what it really was." "And what is it really?" Jake asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to hear the answer. Maria smiled then, and this time the expression did reach her eyes, transforming her entire face. For a moment, Jake caught a glimpse of what she must have looked like before grief carved its lines around her eyes and mouth. "Medicine," she said simply. "Not the kind you buy in a store, but the kind that heals what's really broken." Jake felt something shift inside his chest, a loosening of muscles he hadn't realized were tensed. It was an unfamiliar sensation, uncomfortable and somehow frightening. He had spent so many years building walls around his heart that the idea of them cracking, even slightly, was enough to make him want to run. But there was nowhere to run out here in the open desert, nowhere to hide from the truth in Maria's words or the recognition in her eyes. She saw him, really saw him, in a way that no one had in years. And instead of running from what she saw, she was standing her ground, offering something he wasn't sure he could accept. "I should get back to work," Jake said, but he made no move to turn away. "Yes," Maria agreed, but she didn't move either. "The fence won't fix itself." They stood there for a moment longer, two people who had both learned the hard way that life could take everything from you without warning. The desert stretched around them in all directions, vast and empty and unforgiving, but somehow it felt less lonely with Maria standing there. "The springs," Jake said finally. "Where exactly are they?" Maria pointed toward a cluster of hills about 2 miles to the north, where the land rose up in a series of red rock formations. "Follow the old cattle trail up through the canyon. You'll know them when you see them." "Why are you telling me this?" Jake asked. Maria mounted her horse in one fluid motion, settling into the saddle with practiced ease. Because my grandmother was a wise woman, and she's never been wrong about anything important. She turned her horse toward home, then paused and looked back at Jake. The water tastes different when you understand what it really is, she said. Sweeter. And then she was riding away, her horse's hoofbeats gradually fading into the vast silence of the desert morning. Jake stood watching until she disappeared behind a rise in the land, then turned back to his fence with hands that weren't quite steady. For the rest of that day, as he worked under the relentless sun, Jake found his thoughts returning again and again to Maria's words. The springs were only 2 miles away, close enough that he could ride there and back before dark. He had seen them before, of course, in the early days after he bought the ranch, but he had never thought of them as anything more than a reliable source of water. Now, suddenly, they seemed like something else entirely, something that might hold answers to questions he hadn't even known he was asking. As the sun began to set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that seemed to set the whole world on fire, Jake made a decision. Tomorrow, he would ride to the springs, not because he believed in spirits or healing or any of the things Maria had talked about, but because he was curious. And because for the first time in years, curiosity felt less dangerous than the alternative. Jake woke before dawn the next morning, his body tense with an energy he couldn't explain. He had dreamed of water flowing over red rocks, of voices speaking in languages he didn't understand, of a woman with dark eyes who seemed to know all his secrets. The dreams had left him restless and strangely alert, as if some part of him that had been sleeping for years was finally beginning to stir. He dressed quickly and stepped outside into the cool morning air. Rex padded beside him as he walked to the corral, the old dog's tail wagging with the anticipation of a ride. Jake had trained Rex years ago to be the perfect ranch companion, loyal, obedient, and, most importantly, not given to wandering off or getting into trouble with wildlife. The horse he chose for the journey was Cisco, a sturdy bay gelding who had been with Jake for 8 years. Cisco was not the prettiest horse in the string, nor the fastest, but he was reliable and sure-footed on rocky ground. Those qualities mattered more than speed or beauty when you were riding into unfamiliar territory. As Jake saddled the horse, his mind kept returning to his conversation with Maria. There had been something in her voice when she talked about the springs that suggested they meant more to her than just a source of water. The way she had spoken about her grandmother's stories, the reverence in her tone when she mentioned the healing properties of the water, it all pointed to something deeper than folklore. The ride to the springs took Jake through terrain he rarely visited. The old cattle trail wound through stands of mesquite and palo verde, past towering saguaro cacti that stood like silent sentinels in the morning light. The air was still cool from the night, but Jake could already feel the promise of heat in the sun's rays as they touched his shoulders. Rex trotted alongside the horse, occasionally darting off to investigate interesting scents before returning to his position. The dog seemed to sense that this was no ordinary ranch ride, and his ears were pricked forward with unusual alertness. As they climbed higher into the hills, the landscape began to change. The flat desert floor gave way to rolling hills covered in ocotillo and barrel cactus. Red rock formations jutted up from the earth like ancient monuments, their surfaces carved smooth by thousands of years of wind and rain. Jake had been riding for about an hour when he heard it, the soft sound of water moving over stone. It was faint at first, barely distinguishable from the whisper of wind through the rocks, but as he rode closer, the sound became clearer and more distinct. He rounded a bend in the trail and, suddenly, found himself in a small canyon that opened up like a hidden room in the desert. Sheer red walls rose on 3 sides, creating a natural amphitheater that was sheltered from the wind and somehow cooler than the surrounding desert. And there, at the far end of the canyon, water bubbled up from the earth and flowed over a series of natural stone pools before disappearing into an underground channel. Jake dismounted and ground-tied Cisco, then walked slowly toward the springs. The closer he got, the more he understood why Maria's grandmother had considered this place sacred. There was something about the canyon that felt different from the rest of the desert, something that made him want to lower his voice and move more carefully. The water was crystal clear, so transparent that he could see every grain of sand on the bottom of the pools. It moved with a gentle, hypnotic rhythm that seemed to match his own heartbeat. Somewhere in the rocks above, he could hear the calls of birds he couldn't identify, their songs echoing off the canyon walls in a natural symphony. Jake knelt beside the largest of the pools and cupped some water in his hands. It was surprisingly cold, much colder than he would have expected from a desert spring. He drank it slowly, letting it wash away the dust and dryness of the ride. Maria had been right. It did taste different, cleaner somehow, with a mineral tang that seemed to awaken his senses. As he knelt by the water, Jake found his mind drifting back through the years to memories he had tried to bury. He thought about Sarah, the woman who had left him 10 years ago because she couldn't stand his inability to open up emotionally. He thought about his parents, killed in a farming accident when he was 22, leaving him alone with a mountain of debt and no one to turn to for help. But mostly, he thought about David, his younger brother, who had died in Afghanistan 8 years ago. David had been the only person Jake had ever truly trusted, the only one who understood the complicated mixture of love and pain that made up Jake's relationship with the world. When David died, something inside Jake had died with him, something he hadn't even tried to resurrect. The sound of hoofbeats broke into his reverie. Jake looked up to see Maria riding into the canyon on the same paint horse she had ridden yesterday. She dismounted near the entrance and walked slowly toward the springs, her movements respectful and unhurried. "I thought you might come here," she said as she approached. "My grandmother always said the springs called the people when they were ready to listen." Jake stood up, water still dripping from his hands. "I don't know what I'm supposed to be listening for," he admitted. Maria smiled and knelt beside a smaller pool, cupping water in her own hands. "Maybe that's the first thing you need to learn, how to listen without knowing what you're going to hear." She drank from her hands, then settled herself on a flat rock near the edge of the pool. Jake found himself sitting down as well, drawn by something in her manner that suggested this was not a casual conversation. "Tell me about your brother," Maria said quietly. The statement hit Jake like a physical blow. He had never mentioned David to Maria, had never told anyone in this part of Arizona about his brother's death. "How did you know about him?" he asked, his voice sharp with surprise and sudden anger. "The same way I knew you needed to come here," Maria replied calmly. "My grandmother taught me to see things that aren't always visible on the surface." Jake's first instinct was to stand up and leave, to retreat back to the safety of his ranch and his solitude. But something about the peaceful atmosphere of the canyon kept him in place. The anger was still there, burning in his chest, but it felt somehow muted by the sound of the water and the ancient stillness of the rocks. "David was 2 years younger than me," Jake found himself saying. "He was everything I wasn't. Optimistic, trusting, always believing the best about people. He joined the army because he wanted to help people, wanted to make the world a better place." The words came slowly at first, like water seeping through a crack in a dam. But once they started, Jake found he couldn't stop them. He told Maria about David's letters from Afghanistan, full of stories about the children he was helping and the villages his unit was trying to protect. He told her about the last phone call. 2 days before David's convoy hit an IED on a road they had traveled safely dozens of times before. "The Army sent me his personal effects," Jake continued, his voice growing hoarse with the effort of speaking about things he had never shared with anyone. There was a letter in his gear that he had written but never mailed. It was addressed to a girl back home, someone he had been planning to propose to when his deployment ended. Maria listened without interrupting, her dark eyes fixed on Jake's face with an intensity that should have made him uncomfortable, but somehow didn't. There was no judgment in her expression, no pity or false sympathy. Just patient attention, as if she understood that some stories needed to be told completely before they could be properly heard. "I took that letter to the girl," Jake said. Thought she deserved to know how much David had loved her, how much he had been looking forward to coming home. But when I got to her house, there was a wedding announcement in the paper. She had married someone else 6 months after David deployed. The memory still had the power to make Jake's chest tighten with anger and disappointment. It had been the final proof that his brother's faith in human nature had been misplaced, that trust was just another word for stupidity. So I kept the letter, Jake continued. Kept all of David's things, actually, packed them away in boxes, and promised myself I would never be that naive, never trust anyone enough to get hurt that badly. When he finished speaking, the canyon seemed even quieter than before. Jake could hear his own breathing, could feel his heart beating faster than it should. He had never told that story to anyone, had barely admitted the full truth of it to himself. My husband wrote me letters too, Maria said finally. Every day during the 2 years, he was working on the oil rigs in North Dakota. He wanted to save enough money to buy us a house on the reservation, somewhere we could raise our children close to our families. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, worn envelope. This is the last one he ever wrote. It arrived the day after the accident. I've read it so many times that the paper is starting to fall apart. She held the envelope carefully, as if it might crumble at her touch. For a long time, I thought about throwing it away. It hurt too much to be reminded of all the plans we had made, all the dreams that died with him. But my grandmother told me something that made me change my mind. What did she tell you? Jake asked. She said that love doesn't die just because the person who gave it to you is gone. She said the letters weren't about the past. They were about keeping love alive in the present. Maria looked up at Jake, her eyes bright with unshed tears. She was right. When I read Roberto's letters now, I don't just remember what I lost. I remember what I had. I remember what it felt like to be loved completely without reservation. And that reminds me that it's possible. Jake felt something crack open inside his chest, a painful loosening of muscles that had been clenched tight for years. How do you stand it? He asked. How do you live with knowing that it could all be taken away again? The same way you live with knowing that the sun is going to set every evening, Maria replied. You don't stop watching sunsets just because they end. You don't stop feeling grateful for the light just because you know darkness is coming. The simplicity of her answer made it somehow more profound. Jake had spent so many years trying to protect himself from loss that he had forgotten what he was protecting. He had built walls so high and thick that he couldn't remember what they were meant to keep out. My grandmother used to say that healing water couldn't help someone who refused to drink, Maria continued. She said the springs would always be here, always offering what people needed, but they couldn't force anyone to accept the gift. Jake looked down at the clear water flowing over the red rocks, thinking about all the years he had lived so close to this place without ever really seeing it. The water had been here all along, offering whatever healing it could provide, but he had never thought to look for it. What would David think about the way you've been living? Maria asked gently. The question hit Jake like a punch to the stomach. He knew exactly what David would think about the isolated life Jake had built for himself, about the way he had turned away from human connection and retreated in his solitude. David would be disappointed and sad, but more than that, he would be worried about his older brother. He would want me to try again, Jake admitted. He always believed that good things happened to people who kept their hearts open. And what do you believe? Maria asked. Jake was quiet for a long time, listening to the sound of water over stone and the distant calls of desert birds. When he finally answered, his voice was barely above a whisper. I believe I'm tired of being alone. It was the first honest thing he had said about his own feelings in years, and the admission left him feeling exposed and vulnerable. But there was also relief in finally speaking the truth and acknowledging the loneliness that had become such a constant companion that he had almost stopped noticing it. Maria stood up and walked to the edge of the largest pool. My grandmother said the water here could show people things they needed to see if they were brave enough to look. What kind of things? Jake asked. The truth, Maria replied simply. about who you really are underneath all the walls you've built, about what you really want when you strip away all the fear and anger and hurt. She knelt down and placed both hands in the water, her reflection wavering on the surface like a mirage. "Look," she said softly. Jake joined her at the edge of the pool and looked down into the clear water. For a moment, all he could see was his own face staring back at him, weathered by years in the sun and marked by lines of worry and grief. But as he continued to look, something seemed to shift in his perception. Gradually, he began to see not just the man he had become, but glimpses of the man he had been before life carved all the hardness into his features. He saw traces of a young man who had once believed in love and marriage and family, who had dreamed of building something lasting and good with another person. "I used to want a family," he said, surprising himself at the admission. "Before David died, before Sarah left, I used to imagine what it would be like to have children, to build something that would last beyond my own life." "And now?" Maria asked. Jake continued staring into the water, seeing deeper layers of truth rising to the surface. "Now I'm afraid that if I want something that much again, losing it will kill me." "Maybe," Maria agreed. "Or maybe learning to want something again is the only way to really live." She stood up and brushed the water from her hands. "The choice is yours, Jake. The water will be here whenever you're ready to drink from it. But it can't make the choice for you." As they rode back down the mountain together, Jake found himself looking at the landscape with different eyes. The desert that had seemed so empty and harsh just hours before now appeared full of hidden life and possibility. He noticed plants and birds and rock formations that he had never paid attention to before, as if the world had suddenly become more vivid and detailed. When they reached the place where their paths diverged, Maria heading back toward the reservation, and Jake toward his ranch, she pulled her horse to a stop. "There's something my grandmother wanted me to tell you," she said. 7 words that she said would help you understand what you really need to know. Jake's heart began beating faster. This was it, the moment that would change everything, though he didn't yet understand how. "What are they?" he asked. Maria looked directly into his eyes, her expression serious and intent. "Your brother is still with you always." The words hit Jake with a force that nearly knocked him out of the saddle. He felt tears burning behind his eyes, emotions rising up from places he had kept locked away for years. It was as if Maria had reached into his chest and touched the deepest wound he carried, the one he had never allowed anyone else to see. "How could you possibly know that?" he whispered. "Because love doesn't die," Maria replied. "It changes form, but it never dies. David's love for you didn't end when he died. It just found a new way to exist." As she rode away, her horse disappearing into the shimmering heat of the afternoon, Jake sat motionless on his own horse, letting the truth of her words sink into his bones. For the first time in 8 years, he could feel his brother's presence not as an absence, but as a kind of companionship, a love that had somehow survived death itself. The healing had begun. The weeks that followed Jake's visit to the springs passed differently than any he had experienced in years. Where once his days had been filled with the mechanical routines of ranch work and solitude, now he found himself paying attention to small details he had previously overlooked. The way morning light caught in spider webs stretched between fence posts. The particular sound Rex made when he was content. The way the wind carried different scents depending on which direction it was blowing. It was as if Maria's 7 words had opened something inside him that had been sealed shut for too long. The grief over David's death was still there, would always be there, but it no longer felt like a weight trying to drag him underwater. Instead, it had transformed into something else, a bittersweet awareness of love that continued to exist even in the absence of its source. Jake found himself thinking about David differently too. Instead of focusing on the way his brother had died, he began remembering the way David had lived. The infectious laugh that could brighten any room. The way David had always seen the best in people, even when they couldn't see it in themselves. The letters he had written from Afghanistan, full of hope and determination to make a difference in the world. On a Thursday morning 3 weeks after his visit to the springs, Jake was mending a broken gate when he saw Maria riding toward his ranch house. This time, she wasn't alone. A young Apache boy, perhaps 8 or 9 years old, rode beside her on a small pinto mare. The boy sat straight and proud in the saddle, his dark hair gleaming in the sun. Jake set down his tools and walked over to meet them, Rex trotting beside him with his usual friendly curiosity. As they drew closer, Jake could see that the boy had Maria's eyes, dark and intelligent, with a depth that seemed unusual for someone so young. "This is my nephew, Tommy," Maria said as they dismounted. "My sister's son. I've been taking care of him since she passed last year." The boy stepped forward and extended his hand with formal politeness. "Pleased to meet you, Mr. Morrison," he said in carefully enunciated English. Jake shook the boy's hand, noting the firm grip and direct eye contact. There was something about Tommy that reminded him of David at that age, a combination of curiosity and courage that suggested great things ahead. "Tommy has been asking about you," Maria continued. "He wanted to meet the man who lives next to the sacred springs." "Sacred springs?" Jake asked, looking down at the boy. Tommy nodded seriously. "Grandmother Maria told me that you've been to the healing waters. She said they might help you remember something important." The casual way the boy referred to the springs as healing waters, as if this was simply a fact everyone should know, made Jake smile slightly. He was beginning to understand that the Apache way of looking at the world was very different from his own, more willing to accept mysteries and possibilities that couldn't be easily explained. "What did you want to ask me?" Jake said to Tommy. The boy looked up at Maria, who nodded encouragingly. "I wanted to know if you could teach me about horses," Tommy said. "Aunt Maria says you have some of the best trained horses in the county." Jake glanced at Maria, surprised. It wasn't the request he had been expecting. "What do you want to know about horses?" "Everything," Tommy replied with the enthusiasm of youth. "How to train them, how to take care of them, how to make them trust you. Grandmother Maria says that learning to work with horses teaches you important things about life." There was something in the boy's earnestness that touched a place in Jake's heart he had thought was permanently closed. Tommy reminded him not just of David, but of himself at that age, hungry for knowledge and desperate to prove that he was capable of handling responsibility. "Why horses?" Jake asked. Tommy was quiet for a moment, seemingly gathering his thoughts. When he spoke, his voice was softer than before, touched with a sadness that seemed too old for his years. "My mom used to ride," he said finally, "before she got sick. She promised she would teach me when I got older, but she died before." He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Jake felt something twist in his chest. Here was another child who had lost someone important, another young person trying to figure out how to carry on when the people they loved most were gone. The recognition was immediate and profound. "I suppose I could show you a few things," Jake heard himself saying, "if it's okay with your aunt." Maria smiled, and this time the expression transformed her entire face. "I was hoping you would say that." Over the following weeks, Tommy became a regular visitor to Jake's ranch. At first, Jake had intended to give the boy just a few basic lessons about horse care and safety. But Tommy's enthusiasm and natural aptitude quickly convinced Jake to expand the scope of their time together. The boy had good instincts around the animals, moving slowly and calmly in ways that put the horses at ease. He listened carefully to Jake's instructions and asked thoughtful questions that showed he was really thinking about what he was learning. Most importantly, he seemed to understand intuitively that working with horses required patience and respect rather than force or domination. "The first thing you need to understand," Jake told Tommy during one of their early lessons, "is that horses are honest. They can't lie to you or pretend to be something they're not. If they're scared, you'll know it. If they trust you, you'll know that too. That honesty is something you can count on." Tommy nodded thoughtfully as he brushed Cisco's coat with long, gentle strokes. "Aunt Maria says people should be more like horses in that way. What do you think she means by that?" Jake asked. The boy was quiet for a moment, focusing on his work. I think she means that life is easier when you don't have to guess what someone is really feeling. When people say what they mean and mean what they say. The simple wisdom of the observation struck Jake forcefully. He thought about all the years he had spent hiding his true feelings, pretending to be stronger and more independent than he really was. How much energy had he wasted maintaining walls that ultimately protected nothing and no one? Your aunt is a smart woman, Jake said. She says you're smart too, Tommy replied. She says you just forgot for a while because you were hurting too much to remember. The casual way Tommy delivered this observation, as if it was simply another fact about the world, made Jake pause in what he was doing. Maria had been talking to her nephew about him, sharing insights that went far deeper than casual conversation. "What else does your aunt say about me?" Jake asked, trying to keep his tone light. Tommy grinned, suddenly looking every bit his 8 years. "She says you need more practice at being happy. She says you're good at taking care of things, but not so good at letting things take care of you." Jake found himself laughing, a sound that surprised him with its genuineness. When was the last time he had laughed without reservation, without the bitter edge that had colored his humor for so many years? She might be right about that, he admitted. As the weeks passed, Jake began to look forward to Tommy's visits with an anticipation that surprised him. The boy's presence brought life and energy to the quiet ranch in ways Jake hadn't expected. Tommy asked endless questions about everything from the best way to repair fencing to the migratory patterns of desert birds. His curiosity was infectious, reminding Jake of the joy that could be found in simply paying attention to the world around him. But it was more than just intellectual curiosity that drew Jake to the boy. Tommy had a way of moving through the world that suggested he hadn't yet learned to be afraid of it. Despite the losses he had suffered, his mother's death, the disruption of being raised by relatives, he still approached each day with optimism and wonder. "How do you do it?" Jake asked him one afternoon as they worked together to clean stalls. "Do what?" Tommy asked, looking up from the wheelbarrow he was loading with soiled bedding. "Stay so positive. After everything that's happened to you, how do you keep believing that good things are going to happen?" Tommy leaned on his pitchfork and considered the question seriously. "Aunt Maria says that bad things happen to everyone, but they don't have to be the only things that happen. She says if you spend all your time waiting for bad things, you miss the good things when they come." The boy's words echoed something David had once said years ago during one of their conversations about the risks of military service. David had acknowledged that bad things could happen to him overseas, but he had refused to let that possibility prevent him from trying to help people and make a positive difference. "Your aunt sounds like someone I used to know," Jake said quietly. "Your brother?" Tommy asked. Jake looked at the boy in surprise. He had never mentioned David to Tommy, had barely mentioned him to Maria beyond that one conversation at the Springs. "How did you know I had a brother?" Jake asked. Tommy shrugged as if the answer was obvious. "Aunt Maria talks to grandmother sometimes. Grandmother knows things about people. She told Aunt Maria that you had a brother who died fighting in a war, and that you missed him so much it made you forget how to be happy." The matter-of-fact way Tommy discussed communication with someone who had been dead for over a year should have struck Jake as strange or unsettling. Instead, he found it oddly comforting. In the Apache way of understanding the world, apparently, death was not an end but a transition, and love could continue to exist and influence the living in ways that transcended physical presence. "Yes," Jake said. "I had a brother named David. He died 8 years ago in Afghanistan." "Were you close?" Tommy asked. "Very close. He was my best friend as well as my brother. When he died, I felt like part of me died with him." Tommy nodded with the serious expression of someone who understood loss intimately. "I felt that way when my mom died. Like there was a hole inside me that nothing could fill." "How did you get through it?" Jake asked. The boy was quiet for a moment, seeming to search for the right words. "Aunt Maria helped. She told me that the hole never really goes away, but it changes. Instead of being empty, it becomes a place where you keep all the love you had for the person who died. She said that way, they're still with you, just in a different way." Jake felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes. This was exactly what Maria had tried to tell him at the Springs, what her 7 words had been meant to convey. Love doesn't die. It transforms, but it doesn't disappear. Tommy, Jake said carefully, would you like to see some pictures of David? The boy's face lit up with interest. Yes, please. That evening, for the first time in 8 years, Jake opened the boxes where he had stored his brother's personal effects. He pulled out photo albums and scrapbooks, letters, and certificates, all the tangible remnants of a life cut short too soon. As he and Tommy looked through the materials together, Jake found himself telling stories about David that he had never shared with anyone. He told Tommy about the time David had rescued an injured hawk and nursed it back to health, keeping it in their garage for 2 months despite their mother's protests. He talked about David's terrible singing voice and his wonderful cooking, about his tendency to befriend strays of all species, and his gift for making people laugh, even in difficult circumstances. He sounds like he was a good person, Tommy said as he studied a photograph of David in his army uniform. He was the best person I ever knew, Jake replied. He believed in things I couldn't believe in, like the basic goodness of people and the possibility that one person could really make a difference in the world. Maybe he still does make a difference, Tommy suggested. Maybe he just does it through other people now. Like you. The observation hit Jake with sudden force. He thought about all the ways David's influence had shaped him, all the times over the years when he had made decisions based on what he thought David would want him to do. Even in death, his brother had continued to be a moral compass, a source of wisdom and guidance. And now, through his growing relationship with Tommy and Maria, Jake was beginning to see that David's influence could extend even further. By teaching Tommy about horses and life, by opening his heart to the possibility of connection again, Jake was carrying David's spirit forward in ways he had never considered before. You know what? Jake said, looking at Tommy with something approaching wonder. I think you might be right. That night, after Tommy and Maria had gone home, Jake sat on his front porch with Rex beside him and David's last letter in his hands. For the first time in years, he read the words his brother had written without feeling overwhelmed by grief and anger. Instead, he felt something closer to gratitude for the love they had shared, for the memories that death couldn't take away, and for the possibility that some part of David would always be with him. The desert stretched out before him under a canopy of stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch. Somewhere in the distance, he could hear the call of a coyote, wild and free and unafraid. For the first time in 8 years, Jake Morrison felt something very much like peace. The change in Jake didn't happen overnight, but it was unmistakable. Maria noticed it first in the way he carried himself when she and Tommy visited the ranch. Where once his shoulders had been perpetually tensed as if braced against an invisible blow, now they sat more naturally. His smile, when it came, reached his eyes in a way it hadn't before. Most tellingly, he had begun to initiate conversations rather than simply responding to them. On a warm October morning, Jake surprised both Maria and himself by appearing at the Reservation Community Center, where she worked as a counselor. He had never set foot on reservation land before, despite living on its border for 3 years. The building was a low adobe structure with faded murals depicting traditional Apache scenes painted on its walls. Children's laughter echoed from a playground behind the building, and the smell of fry bread drifted from a kitchen window. Maria looked up from her desk in surprise when Jake appeared in her doorway, his hat in his hands, and an expression of nervous determination on his face. "I wanted to talk to you," he said without preamble, "about Tommy and about some other things." Maria gestured to a chair across from her desk. The office was small, but comfortable, decorated with traditional Apache artwork and photos of community events. A dream catcher hung in the window, casting intricate shadows on the wall as it moved in the breeze. "Tommy's been spending a lot of time at your ranch," Maria said. "I hope he's not been any trouble." "No trouble at all," Jake replied quickly. "In fact, that's part of what I want to talk about. He's a good kid, Maria. Smart, hardworking, respectful. You've done a wonderful job with him." Maria smiled, but Jake could see the sadness that always lurked behind her eyes when she thought about the circumstances that had brought Tommy into her care. He misses his mother. Some days are harder than others. I know something about that, Jake said quietly. About missing someone so much it feels like you can't breathe. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment. Two people who had both learned that grief was not something you got over, but something you learned to carry. Outside the window, Jake could see children playing basketball on a cracked concrete court, their shouts and laughter a reminder that life continued even in the aftermath of loss. "There's something I want to ask you," Jake said finally. "About the springs, about your grandmother's stories. I've been thinking about what you said that day, about healing and trust and letting the water do its work." Maria leaned back in her chair, giving Jake her full attention. "What have you been thinking?" Jake took a deep breath, gathering courage for words he had never spoken aloud. "I've been thinking that maybe I've been looking at healing all wrong. I thought it meant forgetting about David, moving on like he never existed. But that's not what healing is it? What do you think healing is?" Maria asked gently. "I think it's learning to carry love instead of just carrying pain. I think it's finding ways to honor the people we've lost by living the kind of life they would want us to live." Maria nodded slowly. "My grandmother would have liked that definition." Jake fidgeted with his hat brim, working up courage for what he wanted to say next. "I've been thinking about Tommy, about what kind of influence I want to be in his life. He's lost so much already, and I don't want to be just another adult who lets him down." "You won't be," Maria said with quiet certainty. "I've seen the way you are with him. You're patient and kind, and you listen to him like what he has to say matters. That's exactly what he needs right now. But what if something happens to me? What if I get sick or hurt, or—" Jake trailed off, unable to voice his deeper fear that caring about people inevitably led to losing them. "What if the sun doesn't come up tomorrow?" Maria asked. "What if the earth stops spinning? We can't live our lives based on everything that might go wrong, Jake. We have to base them on what might go right." Jake looked out the window again, watching the children play. One boy, perhaps Tommy's age, had fallen and scraped his knee. Instead of crying or giving up, he got back on his feet and rejoined the game. There was something powerful in that simple act of resilience, that refusal to let one setback define the entire experience. "I want to do something for Tommy," Jake said. "Something that would help him feel more connected to his mother's memory." "What did you have in mind?" Maria asked. "His mother rode horses, right? Before she got sick." Maria nodded. "She was an excellent rider. She used to compete in barrel racing when she was younger. Tommy has some of her trophies on his dresser. I want to give him one of my horses," Jake said. "A young mare named Star. She's gentle but spirited, perfect for a beginner who's ready for more responsibility. I want to train them together, help him learn to ride the way his mother would have taught him." Maria's eyes brightened with understanding and approval. "That would mean everything to him, Jake. But are you sure? Giving someone a horse is not a small commitment." "I know," Jake said. "That's exactly why I want to do it. I want Tommy to know that some commitments are meant to last, that some connections are strong enough to weather whatever storms come along." They talked for another hour about practical details, where Tommy would keep the horse, who would help with veterinary care, how they would handle the training schedule. But underneath the logistics, Jake could feel something deeper taking shape. By making this commitment to Tommy, he was also making a commitment to his own healing, to the possibility of building relationships that could survive uncertainty and loss. When Jake left the community center that afternoon, he carried with him Maria's promise to talk to Tommy about the horse and to bring him to the ranch the following weekend for what would amount to an adoption ceremony. But he also carried something else, a growing awareness that his life was expanding in ways he hadn't anticipated. The weekend of the horse adoption, Tommy arrived at the ranch early in the morning, his face glowing with excitement and nervous energy. Maria came with him. Along with an elderly Apache man she introduced as her Uncle Henry, a tribal elder who had apparently asked to be present for the occasion. "Uncle Henry knew my grandmother," Maria explained. "She asked him to look after certain traditions, to make sure important ceremonies happen the way they should." Jake shook hands with the older man, noting the weathered strength in his grip and the keen intelligence in his dark eyes. Henry spoke very little English, but his presence lent a gravity and significance to the day that Jake found both humbling and appropriate. They gathered in the corral where Star waited, her copper-colored coat gleaming in the morning sun. She was a 3-year-old quarter-horse mare with intelligent eyes and a calm disposition that Jake had been cultivating through months of careful training. She was exactly the right horse for a young rider, responsive but forgiving, spirited but not dangerous. Henry spoke quietly in Apache to Maria, who nodded and translated for Jake and Tommy. Uncle Henry wants to offer a blessing for the horse and for Tommy's journey as a horseman. He says that in the old ways, when a person received such a gift, there was always a ceremony to mark the importance of the moment. The ceremony was simple but profound. Henry spoke in Apache, his words carrying the rhythm and cadence of ancient prayers. He sprinkled something that smelled like sage over the horse and invited Tommy to place his hands on Star's neck. When he was finished, he turned to Jake and spoke again. He says, "Thank you," Maria translated, "for understanding that some gifts are too important for casual giving." He says the horse will help Tommy remember his connection to his mother and his heritage. But more than that, she will teach him about responsibility and trust and the bonds that connect all living things. As Jake helped Tommy learn to lead Star around the corral, he found himself thinking about connections and bonds in ways he never had before. Each time the boy spoke gently to the horse, each time Star responded to his guidance, Jake could see threads being woven between them that would shape both their futures. But the connections being forged that day went beyond just boy and horse. Jake could feel his own relationship with Maria deepening and changing, moving from the careful respect of new acquaintances to something warmer and more substantial. She had trusted him with her nephew's happiness, had brought her family's traditions to his ranch, had allowed him to become part of Tommy's story in a meaningful way. As the weeks passed and autumn settled over the desert, Jake's life took on patterns and rhythms he had never experienced before. Tuesday and Thursday afternoons became Tommy's riding lessons, times when the ranch echoed with the boys' laughter and the steady sound of hoofbeats in the arena. Weekend mornings often brought Maria as well, sometimes to watch Tommy ride, but increasingly just to share coffee on the front porch and talk about everything and nothing. The conversations with Maria were unlike any Jake had ever experienced. She had a way of listening that made him want to share thoughts and feelings he had kept buried for years. She asked questions that helped him understand himself better, offered insights that came from a perspective shaped by loss, but not defeated by it. One evening in November, as they sat watching the sunset paint the desert sky in shades of orange and purple, Maria asked a question that stopped Jake's breath in his throat. "What scares you most about caring for people again?" Jake was quiet for a long time, watching the last light fade from the sky and the first stars appear in the gathering darkness. Rex lay at his feet, content and peaceful. Somewhere in the distance, they could hear Tommy talking to Star as he finished his evening chores in the barn. "The same thing that scared me before," Jake said finally, "that if I love them enough, losing them will destroy me." And what would David think about that fear? Maria asked gently. The question hit Jake like a physical blow, but not in a painful way. Instead, it felt like a key turning in a lock he hadn't even realized was still closed. He knew exactly what David would think about his fear, could practically hear his brother's voice in his head. He would say that being destroyed by love is better than being destroyed by the absence of it, Jake replied. He would say that the risk of losing someone is the price you pay for the privilege of having them in your life. Maria reached over and took his hand, the first time she had touched him beyond brief handshakes. Her fingers were warm and callous from years of physical work, real and substantial and alive. "Your brother was a wise man," she said. "Yes," Jake agreed. "He was. And I think he would have liked you very much." They sat in comfortable silence, hands linked, watching the stars emerge in the clear desert sky. Jake felt something settling into place inside him, like puzzle pieces finally finding their proper positions. For the first time in 8 years, he could imagine a future that included love and hope and the possibility of building something lasting with another person. "Maria," he said quietly, "I need to tell you something." She turned to look at him, her face open and expectant in the starlight. "I'm falling in love with you," he said. "With you and with Tommy and with this life we're building together. It terrifies me, but I don't want to run from it anymore." Maria smiled, and in that smile Jake could see his own feelings reflected back at him. "I know," she said simply. "I've been falling in love with you too. With your kindness and your patience and the way you've learned to let people care about you." When they kissed under the vast desert sky, with the sound of Tommy's laughter drifting from the barn and Rex snoring softly at their feet, Jake felt a sense of coming home that had nothing to do with geography and everything to do with the courage to trust and love again. Later that night, after Maria and Tommy had gone back to the reservation, Jake sat alone on his porch with David's last letter in his hands. But this time, instead of reading it as a reminder of all he had lost, he read it as a blessing on all he had found. David's words about love and hope and the importance of staying open to life's possibilities seemed to leap off the page with new meaning. "Thank you," Jake whispered to the desert night, to his brother's memory, to the healing waters of the sacred springs, and to the Apache widow who had spoken 7 words that changed everything. In the distance, a coyote called to the moon, its voice wild and free and full of the ancient promise that love, like water, would always find a way. Spring came early to the desert that year, bringing wildflowers that painted the landscape in brilliant splashes of yellow, red, and purple. The Palo Verde trees burst in a golden bloom, and the cacti produced flowers so vibrant they seemed to glow against the backdrop of blue sky and red rock. It was as if the land itself was celebrating the new life that seemed to be sprouting everywhere Jake looked. He stood at the kitchen window of the house he now shared with Maria and Tommy, watching his stepson practice barrel racing in the arena they had built together over the winter months. Star had grown into a magnificent horse under Tommy's patient care, and the boy had developed into a skilled rider who moved with his mount as if they were one creature. "He's getting fast," Maria said, coming up behind Jake and slipping her arms around his waist. "Pretty soon he'll be ready for real competition." "He already is ready," Jake replied, leaning back against the warmth of his wife's body. They had been married for 6 months now, in a ceremony that blended Apache traditions with Jake's own simple preferences. The wedding had taken place at the Sacred Springs, with Uncle Henry officiating and a small group of family and friends witnessing their vows. His mother would be proud, Maria continued, her voice soft with emotion. She would, Jake agreed, and so would David. The easy way they spoke about their lost, loved one still amazed Jake sometimes. Where once the mention of David's name had been like touching a raw wound, now it felt natural and healing. Maria had taught him that honoring the dead didn't require forgetting them or pretending they had never existed. Instead, it meant finding ways to weave their memory into the fabric of ongoing life. Tommy finished his practice run and rode over to the fence where Jake and Maria were standing. At 10 years old, he had grown tall and strong, his face bright with the confidence that came from mastering difficult skills and knowing he was loved unconditionally. "Did you see that last turn?" he called out, his eyes shining with excitement. "Star barely slowed down at all." "We saw," Jake said proudly. "You two looked like you were flying." Tommy beamed and dismounted, beginning the routine of cooling down and caring for his horse that Jake had taught him was as important as the riding itself. Watching the boy work with such competence and dedication filled Jake with a satisfaction deeper than anything he had ever experienced in his years of solitary ranch life. The sound of vehicles approaching made them all look toward the driveway. 3 trucks were heading toward the house, kicking up clouds of dust in the afternoon heat. Jake recognized them as belonging to neighbors from the surrounding ranches, people who had become friends over the past year, as Jake had gradually opened himself up to community connections. "Looks like the whole crew is coming for dinner," Maria said with amusement. "I better make sure we have enough food." The weekly gatherings had started accidentally, when Jake had invited his neighbor Bill Patterson over to look at some irrigation equipment. Maria had insisted on cooking for them, and somehow the simple dinner had grown into a regular tradition that brought together ranchers, reservation families, and anyone else who needed a place to belong. As the trucks pulled up to the house, Jake felt the familiar warm rush of anticipation that came with sharing his home with others. The shy, isolated man who had once lived here seemed like a stranger to him now, someone from another lifetime whose loneliness he could barely remember. Bill Patterson climbed out of his truck with his wife Ellen and their teenage daughter Sarah. Behind them came a Montoya family from the ranch to the south, along with Uncle Henry and several other Apache elders who had become regular participants in what everyone now called the Sunday gatherings. "Jake," Bill called out, his weather-beaten face creasing into a familiar grin. "That boy of yours is looking mighty professional out there on that horse." "He's been practicing every day," Jake replied, unable to keep the pride out of his voice. "I think he might be ready for the youth rodeo in Tucson next month." The conversation flowed easily as people settled onto the front porch and in chairs scattered around the yard. Maria moved among them with her usual grace, making sure everyone had something to drink while delegating various food preparation tasks to willing volunteers. Jake marveled at her ability to make everyone feel welcome and necessary, to turn a simple gathering into something that felt like family. As the sun began to set and the cooking smells grew more tantalizing, Uncle Henry approached Jake with his usual quiet dignity. The old man had become something of a father figure to Jake over the past year, offering guidance and wisdom in his sparse but meaningful way. "Walk with me," Henry said in his careful English. They walked away from the house toward the corral where stars stood peacefully in the evening light. The conversation at the house continued without them, a warm murmur of voices that spoke of community and belonging. "You have built something good here," Henry said, gesturing toward the house, and the people gathered around it. "We all built it together," Jake replied. "I couldn't have done any of this alone." Henry nodded approvingly. "This is the Apache way. We understand that true strength comes from the connections between people, not from standing apart." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching Star graze in the fading light. In the distance, Jake could see the hills where the sacred springs lay hidden among the rocks, still flowing with their healing water, still offering their gifts to anyone willing to receive them. "There is something I must tell you," Henry said suddenly, "about the day you first came to the springs, about the words my sister spoke to you there." Jake turned to look at the older man with curiosity. Henry rarely spoke about his deceased sister, Maria's grandmother, but when he did, his words carried special significance. "What about that day?" Jake asked. Henry was quiet for a long time, seeming to choose his words with great care. "My sister had visions sometimes, dreams that showed her things that were going to happen. She saw you coming to this land many years before you arrived." Jake felt a shiver run down his spine despite the warm evening air. "She saw me. She saw a man who had lost his way, who had forgotten how to trust in the goodness of life. She saw that he would need special medicine, special words that would help him remember who he was meant to be." Henry paused and looked directly at Jake. "The 7 words that Maria spoke to you. Your brother is still with you always. Those were not Maria's words. They were my sister's words, given to her in a vision and passed down to be spoken at exactly the right moment." Jake felt his breath catch in his throat. The idea that those powerful, life-changing words had been waiting for him, prepared by someone he had never met, seemed both impossible and perfectly logical at the same time. "Why are you telling me this now?" Jake asked. "Because my sister's vision did not end with the speaking of those words," Henry replied. "She saw what would come after, the healing, the love, the family that would grow from your willingness to trust again. She saw the children you and Maria will have together, the grandchildren who will carry both Apache and white blood, and the ranch that will become a gathering place for anyone who needs to belong somewhere. The mention of future children made Jake's heart skip a beat. He and Maria had talked about having children together, but they had agreed to take things slowly to let their blended family solidify before adding to it. The idea that their family would continue to grow, that their love would create new life, filled him with a joy so profound it was almost overwhelming. She saw all of that in her vision. Jake asked. Henry smiled, an expression that transformed his usually serious face. She saw much more than that. She saw you teaching Tommy's children to ride, saw you helping other broken people find their way back to healing. She saw this place becoming exactly what it was always meant to be, a home where love grows strong enough to overcome any loss. As they walked back toward the house, where the dinner preparations were reaching their cheerful climax, Jake thought about the miraculous chain of events that had brought him to this moment. David's death, devastating as it had led him to this remote corner of Arizona. His isolation and pain had made him receptive to Maria's words in a way he might not have been if he had met her under different circumstances. Every loss, every moment of despair, every wall he had built around his heart had been part of a larger pattern that had ultimately led him home to the life he was meant to live. The realization was humbling and wonderful at the same time. Dinner was a boisterous affair, with multiple conversations happening simultaneously and children running between the tables that had been set up in the yard. Jake found himself in the middle of it all, participating in discussions about cattle prices and water rights and the upcoming harvest festival, but also stepping back periodically to simply observe the scene with wonder. A year ago, the idea of his quiet ranch being filled with this many people would have sent him into a panic. Now, he couldn't imagine life any other way. The isolation that had once felt necessary for his survival now seemed like a kind of death, a cutting off from the very connections that made life worth living. "You look happy," Maria said, appearing at his elbow with a plate of food. "I am happy," Jake replied, accepting the plate with a smile. "Happier than I ever thought possible." "Even with all this chaos?" she asked, gesturing toward the controlled mayhem of the dinner gathering. "Especially with all this chaos," Jake said. "This is what David always wanted from me, you know? A big, messy, complicated family and a house full of people who cared about each other." Maria leaned against him, and Jake wrapped his free arm around her shoulders. "He would love seeing you like this." "He does see me like this," Jake replied with quiet conviction. "That's what I finally understand about those 7 words you spoke to me. David isn't gone. He's part of everything good that's happened since. He's in Tommy's laughter when he's riding Star. He's in our wedding vows. He's in every choice I make to trust instead of retreat." As if summoned by their conversation, Tommy appeared beside them, his face flushed with excitement from running around with the other children. "Dad," he said, using the title he had started calling Jake shortly after the wedding. "Uncle Henry says you're going to tell the story tonight. The story about the springs and how you and Mom met." Jake looked over at Uncle Henry, who was sitting with the other elders near the fire pit that Bill Patterson had built for evening gatherings. The old man caught his eye and nodded encouragingly. "He says it's important for the children to hear stories about how love finds its way," Tommy continued. "He says stories like that help people remember to keep their hearts open." Jake felt a familiar flutter of nervousness at the idea of speaking to the entire group, but it was overwhelmed by a deeper sense of rightness. His story, their story, had become something worth sharing, a testament to the power of healing and hope that might help others find their own way through loss to love. "I suppose I could tell that story," Jake said, looking down at Tommy's eager face. "If you really want to hear it." "I do," Tommy said emphatically, "and I want to hear the part about the 7 words again. Those are the best part." As the evening wore on and the stars appeared in the clear desert sky, Jake found himself standing near the fire with everyone gathered around him in a rough circle. Maria sat with the other women, Tommy cross-legged at her feet. Uncle Henry and the elders occupied places of honor near the fire, their weathered faces reflecting decades of listening to and telling stories that mattered. "This is the story," Jake began, his voice carrying clearly in the still night air, "of a man who thought he was too broken to be fixed, and an Apache widow who knew 7 words that could heal any wound." As he told the story of their meeting, of his first visit to the sacred springs, of the gradual opening of his heart to love and trust again, Jake could see recognition and hope lighting up faces around the circle. Others had experienced there,